Blue Heaven, Fireside, Fantasy and Sci-Fi. And in this episode, we're re-recording because we lost the first one. But in our defense, it was during a hurricane. Who knows? A blip of internet outage. Who knows what happened? But it was non-recoverable. This episode, we're going to be doing part 1 of the Dark Tower, the final book of the Dark Tower series. Part 1, The Little Red King. We're going to be reviewing that section without spoilers from the rest of the book, even though we have read further.
Just a hair further, but
just a hair further.
The part 1, and then we're going to do another episode, part 2, which is Blue Heaven. But those two sections will basically take up about half of the book, essentially, and then we'll
we're getting through this book so fast. I don't want to say I'm worried, but like I'm like, where's it? Like, when's it gonna get really twisted? You know what I mean? Like right now, we don't want to talk about where we are now because it's not in this section, but we're getting through it fast. I'm enjoying it though. It's a good book. I'm glad I read this series. So up to this point, I'm glad that I've read it.
At least you're not like, God, let's get it over with. It's
terrible. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. I'm like, how are they going to wrap this up in just 2 more sections? I'm feeling like I want more. Like there should be another book that I'm not aware of.
Well, we talked about it before. He's been hinting.
I know. All right, but this episode, The Little Red King, this is part 1, and it starts out with, where we left off from Song of Susanna. At the end of Song of Susanna, Susanna Dean has been taken over by Mia, who is determined to give birth to Mordred Deshane. Mia and Susanna, who now share the same body, in 1999, where Mia plans to deliver her monstrous child, Mordred, who is prophesied to be both a savior and destroyer. So in Song of Susanna, the book ends right there at the Dixie Pig. They go through a doorway to Fedek, to this futuristic labor chamber teleportation device thing.
Weird sci-fi thing.
Meanwhile, Callahan and Jake are outside of the Dixie Pig about to enter in, and that's where the book picks up.
Yeah, they get sent there instead of the other place and vice versa. So now it's their chore to rescue Susanna, or die trying, which they think they're going to do. It's basically die trying.
Yeah, there's a lot of prophesied death in this, especially in the last 3 books or so.
Yes,
and he wrote the last 2 or 3 books after he got hit by the van in real life. Do you think there's any kind of he started thinking about mortality?
Definitely.
Of course, I got to say, probably his entire life, no one has ever thought about mortality more than Stephen King. Just judging by the way his books are written, he's probably, it wasn't the first time the concept.
No. In context, once he got back into the groove of writing, he wrote the last 3 books back to back to back, because he knew. I think that was kind of the spur. I could die before I finish this series. The way I've been going, so I need to get these books out, and he did.
And this book, more so than any of them, I mean, this book not only picks up right where the last book left off, but it actually kind of retells the ending of the previous book, in this. And I didn't go back and judge the first chapter of this book to the last chapter of the last book if there was any kind of changes or retcons that were done.
No, not really. I mean, it kind of picks up the first chapters, basically them just at the Dixie Pig, essentially.
Yeah. Another time that the Dark Tower series does that is with the train with Blaine the Mono.
The wastelands into
it's like it almost recaps a little bit the last little bit. But in this one, so we begin with Jake and Callahan. They enter the Dixie Stampede, the Dixie Pig, and they fight the Cantoi, the Tahines, the vampires, and little bugs.
And the little bugs.
And they use the turtle, which I can never say the name of the turtle.
Chapolda.
I think it's
Chapolda.
Whatever it's called. They have the turtle, and they use it to distract. The Cantoi and the Tahine are distracted by it, but the vampires don't seem to be, at least not after some amount of time.
So the Cantoi and the Tahine, the bugs aren't affected by it because they're bugs.
No, they're bugs. They don't care.
So there's the tapestry that's hanging up there that has Arthur Eld at the feast, and they're eating babies and stuff like that. Well,
Yeah.
like behind that tapestry is another room, and it turns out that if you go back to Wolves of the Kala and Callahan telling his stories, you find out from spoiler for another book, Salem's Lot, where he
Hmm.
fights or attempts to fight a vampire, which you find out there's different types of vampires. Well, this is behind this screen are the type 1 vampires,
Yeah.
the real like big bad vampires, and the type 2s and type 3s or can be affected by this totem, but those type 1s, they just it's not a thing. They just
Yeah.
kind of overlook it. And so
Their intelligence score is higher than
right.
the 2 and 3. They can their passive intelligence can overcome it.
So they go in, and their plan was, we're going to stay, 10 feet away from each other, no more than 10 feet. And you just kind of mow through this room and try and get to wherever Susanna might be, knowing they're probably going to die. But then Callahan has like a kind of like a vision from God, from Gan, whatever, that tells him, hey, use this turtle totem, and he jumps up on the table and he holds it up, and Jake's kind of like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But then he realizes it distracts him, and Callahan knows this is the only way for them to save Susanna is for him to do this, sacrifice himself, and to tell Jake to run and get through. And Roland and to one extent Eddie both channel themselves through Callahan during this part too. And basically Roland speaks through Callahan and tells him, you've got to go. Jake takes off and basically leaves Callahan there to like fight off the Cantoi, the Tahine, who are still mesmerized, but now those type 1 vampires are making their way through that crowd, and he knows once they get there, there's not much he can do. But what's cool about this thing is like the last book a little bit, but in this book, and as you go through this book more, the term the white comes up more and
Mhm.
more.
Yeah.
And this is like the first thing where the white really shines through,
Hmm.
and like because he starts like glowing, and
Yeah.
like it's like this immense power kind of flowing through Callahan. He doesn't even need his cross anymore. He's just like he
Yeah.
is that like representation of the good of the white. And that was a really cool scene. And then like of course
It's
he
a good payoff. The turtle thing, so the turtle thing comes up in 2 previous books. It's not just Song of Susanna. I think there's a prior book.
right. Well, he's the
Um,
guardian. He's one of the guardians of the beams.
well, right, but I just mean the aspect of using the turtle to like mesmerize people of
Right.
this world. So,
Right.
it's been used a few times to, I think, to get into the hotel. Susanna uses it to get in the
Yes, she used
hotel.
it for the
She uses it to
hotel
get money from that
to get
guy or
money from
whatever.
the guy. Yeah.
And it's just like people of this world see it and they're mesmerized by it.
And they just
And
walk by it. If they happen to glance at it, it's like they're instantly attracted.
right, right. And that's a cool thing, even in those stories. But I thought this was like whenever this moment happened in the book, I thought, oh, I didn't even think about that this could happen even to the
Right.
Cantoi. I thought, oh, this is just for the simple humans in this world. But, it even mesmerized these people in this room. So that was I thought it was a pretty neat payoff to
Yeah,
that
definitely.
item, in the story.
And then of course we get, Callahan, the death of Callahan. He saves a bullet essentially to take himself out so that the vampires can't turn him.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the last fu to the vampires, because that like you find out he's been like a person, you find out through Wolves that he's been a person that they've been kind of like obsessed with finding.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like at the last minute he takes himself out. And the little conversation he has with Roland is really cool. And
He goes out
yeah,
a
I mean,
gunslinger.
he goes out a gunslinger essentially, and and he saves Jake to be able to go on.
I guess it's Wolves of the Kala, where he describes where he goes to the conference room and jumps out the window because
Right,
he won't allow them to make him a vampire like they are. And so this was a callback to that, because even now he'd rather kill himself than allow them the
right.
privilege to, and this was his way of like, he can't win, but he can keep them from winning, at least in the story of his
And
his life.
I can't remember if I'm pretty sure it's in this section too, where he comes to the realization, and we had this discussion and when we talked about Wolves of the Kala and whether or not Susanna should have an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like he comes to this realization that maybe he was wrong about the whole thing,
Yeah.
and that he should have maybe supported this because like seeing what was in the Dixie Pig and all this stuff, like
yeah, I still think that is like a funny, like, it's literally a demon baby, like
yeah, exactly.
I think in real life, even the strongest, most staunch right wing supporter of pro life
Would be
would
yeah
be
if you said,
would
well,
be like, but it's a demon.
but it's a demon, like
They'd be like, okay, all
right,
right,
okay, right.
yeah,
So yeah, so he, of course, you couldn't have it because then the story would end it. But
yeah.
um,
It wouldn't have worked.
no,
It
yeah,
wouldn't have
exactly,
worked if
wouldn't
they
work.
had. Yeah, I think if they had tried to do that, whoever was administering it would have like had a heart attack and died.
It
It never would have
died.
worked. Yeah,
Yeah, it never would have worked. But so yeah, so now like yeah, then Jake gets to escape, and obviously still being chased by some people, but he gets out of the main room, and that's when he comes to the kitchen where you got the cook with the boar's head that's cooking
mm-hmm.
like whatever.
Yeah,
And he's kind of has the standoff. You get the sci-fi thing with Jake and the in the jungle, and basically like the holodeck of Star Trek,
yeah.
where he goes in and like whatever your deepest fear is, it manifests that fear.
So
And
I was confused in this part. Whenever Jake is trying to escape the Dixie Pig and find Susanna, and he's sort of running through all these back rooms of the Dixie Pig, it was confusing to me. At what point did he cross over into
well, that's
Fennec?
I think this part with the studio, whatever you want to call it. I think that
Yeah.
is actually into Fennec. I
Okay.
think that's the doorway because there's a part where he goes through a door, and I think that was basically the doorway into Fennec. And then he
Yeah.
comes to this part, and I think this was basically like the first line of defense for getting all the way into Fennec. Because then he has to go to the door to get to where Susanna is. Your greatest fear is manifested. And Jake realizes that his biggest fear was like the dinosaurs. And so these dinosaurs come up, but he realizes that, hey, if I can't interact with the dinosaurs, they won't get us. But if I go in here, I will.
Mm-hmm.
So he and Oi switch bodies, and basically Oi goes into his consciousness, and vice versa. And Oi has to use Jake's body to walk through this thing. Oi's never walked on two legs, and Jake's trying to tell him things, but Oi can't do anything other than bark and say little short words. That's just a funny little thing. But obviously he gets through, and then the other guys die because they don't realize how dangerous it is. And they start shooting the little cameras, but like eventually the dragon that the one guy's afraid of winds up killing them.
It used their fears too,
Yes. Yeah, so it uses anybody's fear that goes through there.
Yeah. Yeah. So Mia and Susanna are taken into Fennec to give birth to Mordred, where Mia goes crazy and is eaten by Mordred. Susanna uses the opportunity to steal a gun and escape, carried by a blind robot. So this was my favorite part of the whole book.
Yeah.
Well, there's some good. We've read further, and there's more good parts. But
Right.
in this section, this was like the iconic section for me. Every Dark Tower book has one section where you're reading it and you stop and you go, "Is this the
What am I
same book
reading? Yeah, I
series?
know,
What am
right?
I?" Yeah. How did all this change into this at this point? But this was that section for me where it begins with this like I don't even know what era of sci-fi to call it.
Right.
There's elements of like 60s like super campy sci-fi, but then there's also elements of more modern sci-fi, and like obviously it's all dark fantasy. But they're like, so we talked about this again. We're re-recording this. We're trying to relive some of these conversations, but I don't think we ever came to conclusion on this one anyway. So it'll be safe for us to talk about it again. But like, I still don't know what was going on where Mia and Susanna share the same body. Mia is pregnant in Susanna's body, but Susanna is not showing for most of the time.
Right.
And then And then in this scene, they split them into two bodies again, but yet Susanna now carries the baby, and they have a machine that is like particle by particle moving the baby out of Susanna's body and into Mia's body, where Mia is going to actually give birth to the baby.
Right.
And I think that's the best explanation that you can come up.
So the way I, when Mia's first introduced back in Wolves,
Yeah.
into the Song of Susanna and stuff, you think you at first think that it's another one of her personalities, and then we talked about how that Mia is essentially the demon from the circle that Roland had sex with way back in the
Oh yeah, I forgot
first
about all this
book.
too. Yeah.
And so then when he has sex with her, that
Yeah.
succubus, she takes
This
his
was such a
seed. Such a
think about
crazy
think
concept
about the,
just to
like
begin
this
with.
is like such a long con. Like think
Yeah,
about how
oh, I know,
long of a
right? Yeah, this goes back to like a long way. And so and then you get into the wastelands,
yeah.
where they have to bring Jake over from his win to them, and the
Yeah.
only way to do that is for Susanna to distract another demon and
Yeah.
to have sex with him. And of course, she has sex with him. Turns out that they're basically the same demon, that they can change gender, sex, whatever. And so when Roland had sex with it originally,
It held on.
she had sex with Susanna. She used I don't know what else you call it. It used that seed to impregnate
Yeah.
Susanna, but not
And
really. It still was itself impregnated along
yeah.
with Susanna.
And
And
don't
so
forget the Crimson King also
and
somehow is in
somehow the Crimson King also had sex with this thing at some point, or they artificially inseminated it with the Crimson King seed, because
I don't know if this will ever be explained, but are the demon from the first book and the demon from what was that in where that happens? Is that in the Wastelands?
the Wastelands.
Or the demon from both of those books, whether they're the same demon or two different demons, somehow they work for the Crimson King. And this was like a plan all along. Like
Yeah, well, essentially it is. It was a plan, at least in the sense of,
and so
like, I don't
the
know if it goes
Crimson
back as far as the first encounter, but I definitely think the second encounter, and there's always the whole deal of like the Crimson King and that side know more than Roland does.
yeah.
And I think they know what, and you don't really know how, but they know essentially where, and what Roland's doing every step of the way. And I think they
Mm-hmm.
planned this because they knew that at this point that this was going to happen, so they set it in motion
Well,
for
Mordred is being born to defeat Roland.
to
He's an
defeat
anti-Roland.
Roland,
He's the
and
anti-Roland.
right.
And so it makes sense that they would also make it from his like DNA, from
And
his
it's
material.
right. And it's essentially like a prophecy. Like he's been prophesized. And so
Yeah.
like they're taking that prophecy and making it real by setting forth all these things in motion to make sure that the
Yeah.
prophecy does become real. And then but Mia makes a deal with Richard Sayre and North Central Positonic Sombra, whatever, to essentially no longer be a demon, that she's going to be like Pinocchio. She's going to be a real boy. And then she's going to get to raise Mordred and be the mother, because that's all she's ever wanted,
Yeah.
to be a mother.
Well,
And
that's
Mia means mother, and like all this stuff. And then
it,
you slowly find out that they've been lying to her, and I think she starts to realize that they've been lying to her, but she doesn't want to accept that. And Susanna's like, in their interactions, just trying to like make her realize that, hey, these people are like, they're not your friends.
yeah.
They're trying to get Mordred for their own purposes, and you're just a means to an end. And that's kind of where they're going back and forth here. Let me be the mom. Well, you'll get to do it for a couple years, and it's like 6 months, and then it's like this, and then and then of course it turns out it's a few
Not at
minutes.
all. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing too. Mia is a sympathetic character.
She
And
is.
I kept thinking that she was going to end up helping Susanna, which I mean, in a way, they go back and forth, and it's kind of like in Song of Susanna, they have a conversation like, kill me if this is not going to work out, or kill me if they're going to try to steal the baby or whatever. Like they kind
Right.
of have a conversation about escaping together. But in this book, yeah, she gives birth to the baby, and then she just completely like flips and starts worshiping Mordred
Right.
and is happy to be literally devoured by him.
Right.
And yeah, just goes completely off her rocker after Mordred is born. Like the moment Mordred is born,
But I
and
do
she
think,
looks at him.
one thing about that is, and so like we were talking about before, where so Mia
Oh,
is.
I just had a thought. Go ahead though, because don't
So
let me
basically,
forget.
Mia exists in this other realm, like in Fedic, essentially, like because they like when Susanna and her meet at the Castle Discordia, like
Mm-hmm.
they are both there. Like that's where Mia physically exists, and like she's showing there. She's obviously pregnant, and she has the baby, and then like when Mia comes where Susanna is in New York, like she has her legs. So they both exist, but they both exist in different planes. And so when they're in the birthing place,
Mm-hmm.
both of those existences are brought together, and they're
They're both.
also
Huh. That's
changing
interesting.
Mia in this part. This is where I think they're actually changing Mia from being a supernatural spiritual being to an actual flesh and blood being, which is
Yeah.
one way that Mordred is able to do that, and also that she's able to give birth because she wasn't a flesh and blood being up until this point.
Yeah.
And then also the way King writes the reaction of the people in the room, like Sayre and the guards and the doctor and the nurses,
Yeah.
and when Mordred turns from the baby to the spider and starts doing that,
Yeah.
they were not expecting that
Yeah.
whatsoever. Like they just thought,
They're
this
kind of like, oh crap.
superhuman baby's coming. They didn't know about the spider aspect
What
of
did we
this.
just do?
What did
Yeah.
we just do? And that is what the surprise is, what gives Susanna the opportunity to grab the gun and to be able to fight her way out.
Right. So
But
that's an interesting, but I hadn't thought about that this is the first time that physically they're both in the same world together.
right,
Every other time they've visited each other, one of them has
one of
been
them's been Todash.
Todash, yeah. And but the thought that I had that I said let me go back to, don't let me forget, is I was thinking about how Mordred gave the thought to was it like was he eat a weasel or something? He eat some kind of woodland creature.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Um
in the
but
little room.
he gives it that comforting thought before he does it, so that it's like
Right.
okay with dying. Could it be that Mordred gave that thought
Ooh, it could
to
be to
Mia,
Mia.
and
It
that's why
could
she
be.
changed so rapidly? Even if it was like in that moment, this is literally the first seconds of Mordred's life, and Mordred grows more and more conscious and aware, as time goes on, just like a real baby would. Only it's happening so rapidly for Mordred,
Right.
that it could be that in that moment he immediately saw Mia as his mother and projected like this feeling of love
But he was also
and
hungry.
and surrender, but also hungry, and she accepted it, and and projected this like worship and
Well, the first thing
willingness to be devoured.
well, the first thing is she like goes to breastfeed him, and
Hmm.
like the nurture thing, and Mordred is born with all the knowledge of Roland and the Crimson King essentially, and he knows that Mother is the provider and the feeder, essentially. Susanna grabs the gun, she shoots people, she tries to kill Mordred, and when she has him in his sight, she gets bumped and she shoots, and it just takes one of his spider legs off. And of course, he runs away, and then she gets away. But that whole scene is just absolutely wild, like absolutely wild. Just the concept of everything.
Yeah. Well, even the next parts are, and I know this is like maybe not the best way to introduce the book because you're giving a spoiler away, but like someone the other day, even since we recorded and lost the recording, asked me about the Dark Tower series. Said, "Is that any good?" And I said, "Well, the first book is about a gunslinging cowboy, and so far in the last book, I have a lady being carried around by a blind robot trying to find the correct door to New York, 1999." I said, "That's how strange the series is that you go somehow you find a way to go from point A to point
Yeah, exactly.
47, you know." And this was like, I don't know, this might be my favorite. It's not my favorite book so far, but my favorite moment so far might be this moment where
Right.
you get the realization about just how far we have come from the gunslinger. Like,
You
this
know,
is so
right.
outside the world of the gunslinger. It's so crazy.
And you've got the blind robot. So basically, it's Andy the robot, but a
Yep,
different
yep,
version. And so Susanna doesn't. All she knows is there's Andy again. So
yeah,
she shoots his eyes out, and he's
yeah.
like basically Jeeves the butler kind of robot. He's like
Yeah, he wouldn't have,
nice as
even with
can
his
be.
eyes, he wouldn't have hurt her. Yeah.
Right. Fennec is also like one of the more basically it is the most interesting place so far in all the books to me is because Fennec is essentially Grand Central Station for doors to different times in
Hmm.
history. And you come to realize that back when in the old days with the old people that people would take vacations to go to see like the Twin Towers getting hit by the planes or and what's crazy is all the times that they speak of aren't like great times. It's all
Yeah,
these like
yeah. So
horrific
the tragedies.
all
Yeah,
the tragedies and things in history and like and that's just
that's
human nature.
true.
It's people want to
Yeah,
see that stuff. They don't want the lovey-dovey stuff. They want the death and
that's true.
destruction and stuff.
Yeah,
But yeah, so like you got all these doors to all these different time periods. And there's the door to the Kennedy assassination, and there's who knows what else. I'm sure there's a door to somewhere outside of Japan where you can see the bombs being dropped, and
mm,
all kinds of things.
yeah.
And like it kind of gives you an insight into what these people were like back then too.
And it's also, so all these different doors are going to different times, but it doesn't. There's, are they affecting these timelines? You know, if they go to a timeline and change something, or is it this string theory where like they, because they go, they created a new
A
timeline.
new timeline. Also wondered too, like, so in this whole universe or in universes, you've got the two Keystone worlds. You got the one where Stephen King is, the one that they're concerned about, and then you've got Roland's world, mid-world and stuff, and in-world and in-world and all that. And in Stephen King's line that time only goes one way. So once that time hits, you can't go back.
Hmm.
And so like, and then all these other universes exist where they can go at any point into any of those worlds. So my guess is like just because those are kind of adjacent worlds that don't really matter. I mean, I don't say they don't matter, but they're not the Keystone World. I guarantee you, they weren't letting tourists
Oh yeah.
go to the Keystone World.
Hmm.
They were just allowed to go to like the Stand World or whatever. Whereas if they did do something, it wouldn't matter as much as if they went into the Keystone World and affected something.
Yeah.
And so, like, yeah, I mean, I definitely think they had ways around it, but it's just a cool concept, like time travel tourism, like.
Yeah. It is cool. It's cool. Yeah.
And so, like,
La-
basically, Susanna knows the door she needs to be at to where Jake is going to come through, and so she has the robot take her to there and basically just waits and
yeah.
till he gets there, and then eventually he gets there, and then they have to do the password, which is the chassis.
The funny thing about Roland and Eddie's story is in the last book, they left in John Cullum's car. They go and they meet Stephen King, but they also talk to the bookstore owner, Tower, Henry Tower,
Tower and Deep No.
Tower in Deep
And
No.
they
And
get the piece of paper to have
Yeah.
title to the land.
But then they have a moment in this book where they're like, did we really do enough? Are we really leaving the fate of all existence, as far as they're concerned, in the hands of three people that they really left very vague instructions and just
Yeah,
like
and they
a
definitely
handwritten.
they don't trust Tower at all.
Yeah, they don't trust Tower, and so there's a bit of a like if you think about it in the timeline of Eddie and Roland, they literally leave John Cullum, goes talk to Stephen King, and then they leave Stephen King's, and then they realize they messed up, and so they go and they call John Cullum again, even though
Even though he's supposed to be going to
yeah,
Vermont,
he's supposed to have left, but Eddie has a
he just
feeling that
happens. He has a feeling that they're going to
that
call.
he hasn't left and that he can still catch him if he calls. So sure enough, Roland and Eddie with Calvin Tower and Aaron Deepno, who are under the threat of the Somber Corporation, they form the Tet Corporation. John Collum, Moses Carver, and Eddie Deepno, a group of protectors working to defend the rose, a symbol of the tower's existence in Keystone Earth. The rose must be preserved at all costs, as it holds the fate of all worlds. So that's a synopsis of this
I
section.
like
But
that.
so
Go ahead.
John Cullum is supposed to, at the end of his life, he seems like he's retirement age.
He's
All of a
getting
sudden,
it. He's a handyman,
he's gonna pick up the mantle of running a multinational corporation that is
multi-billion-dollar,
yeah that is gonna
eventually
battle
multi-billion-dollar.
in courts over custody of this property in New York between two other corporations,
They're
rival
gonna.
corporations.
He's gonna
And
subvert Sombra and North Central at every time they do
yeah,
anything that he's supposed to be there.
and Roland and Eddie have complete
Complete
faith
faith,
that he's the guy to do this.
and basically
Basically, he's the only guy. I mean, who
he's the
else could
only
it
guy.
be?
Well,
Stephen King would be a better choice, maybe.
they go back and they tell him, and like you just like you picture this guy in like old jeans, like
Yeah,
a work shirt, and he's got the little spiral notebook thing that fits in your pocket, and like a
yeah.
little pencil, and he's like, okay, like
I
flips
had,
it open, let
dude.
me take some notes here, and that's literally what he's doing. He's like, okay, save the world, save the rose. Let me get this straight. You want me to invest in Apple and something called Microsoft and like all
Yeah,
this stuff, so like they can get all this money, and then you want me to go convince this other man that his niece is alive
who
in
at
a
this point has
different
been missing.
universe. Yeah,
Yeah,
who's been missing forever, who's actually in a different universe and is a gunslinger on a mission to save a tower and a rose to save
yeah,
not only this universe, but there's multiple universes. And we want you to
yeah,
convince this guy, and y'all form this corporation to do all this stuff. And he's just like, all right, got it. We'll get right
yeah.
on that. And
He's like he's like standing there with a pair of overalls, one of the things undone, a
the straw coming out of the
a straw coming out of his mouth, and he spits on the ground and says, "I'm your guy."
I'm your guy, and he does it, which is even crazier. Is like he's successful at it. But yeah, like so that's their whole thing. Is like they.
I'm cheating a little bit here. I'm cheating a little bit here because I've read further into the story, and I'm not going to give any spoilers. But I just want to say, John Cullum and there's other people that present the same thing. There's some people that are just so willing to fall into like
Yes.
helping. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like the people that stare at the turtle and are mesmerized. It's like they're just like once they call them the walk-ins in this world, but once they see the walk-ins and they hear the story, they're game. You know what I mean? Like I think if I were in this situation, I would be like, no, I gotta go to work tomorrow. I got things to do. Like
Right.
you
You
know,
want
like
me
I
to do
can't.
what now?
Yeah, I can't help you, but these people they come in contact with are just like game for it. They're down.
Right.
They're
Well,
ready.
going back to the first time they meet John Cullum, like there's this phenomenon in this area around where Stephen King lives with the
Yeah,
walk-ins, and like it's basically people or whatever coming through what you might think of as a thinny from a different universe into their universe, and they're known as walk-ins. And John Cullum is like fascinated with this, and
yeah,
so that helps. But we get into this idea of like you said, a little bit further, you find out, a character that Roland is sure was put
I'm
there
sure there's people in the
by
previous books
Ka,
too.
and
Yeah.
like that he is sure that John Cullum was put here specifically by Ka, by Gan, by Stephen King,
Yeah.
whoever, specifically for this, and he has full trust in and faith in Ka that John Cullum is this person, and if he wasn't this person, he wouldn't have been the person that they put there. He wouldn't have been the person that was at the general store when the fighting originally broke out. He wouldn't have been
Yeah.
the guy that like helps them escape and been the calm person and like the person that just accepts this freely from the very beginning because it's Ka. Ka is why John Cullum is going to do this because there's no other choice because Ka dictates that. And then
is it that John Cullum was put in their path because Ka, Stephen King, Gan, God, whatever, knew that this was the right man for the job, to help them and to run this corporation and all that we just said? Or is it that anybody could have been there, but much like the turtle, they fell victim to the gaze of it. They fell mesmerized by the walk-ins and are willing to commit themselves to the goal.
well, I think Roland 100% believes that John Cullum was put there on purpose, that he was chosen, divinely chosen. It was, John Cullum was born,
Mm-hmm.
60 something years ago, however old he was. His purpose of being born was to eventually do
Yeah.
this. And
Yeah.
everything in his life led up to for him to be in that store at that time when Roland and Eddie walked in and they crossed paths for the first time. Like that is 100% what Roland believes. What is Ka? What is Gan? What is God? Who is Stephen King? Is he that? Is he just a conduit of that? When Callahan realizes that he's a character from a Stephen King book, and he says, "No, I know I'm real. I've lived my entire life. I'm not
Yeah.
just some character." What Stephen King wrote in Salem's Lot is just a snippet of his life. Basically, every character in every book ever created, you're looking at a small snippet of their life. They did a bunch of things before they were in
Mm-hmm.
this book that
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that part didn't exist because it wasn't written in that
Huh.
book. They are still that part. So
All characters written anywhere, they were written with some purpose in mind,
right,
like if John Collum, like you said, he lived his entire life. In reality, he didn't live his entire life. He doesn't exist. He only exists in
he
this
was
story.
only in that part, one part of that story. Yes,
But the way the Dark Tower is written is like there's stories within stories, and he had a life within
right.
one of those stories, and it only existed because one day he would lead up to this moment within another story where he would be the key piece that Roland needs to the puzzle.
And
And
just because you don't know what he did when he was 10 years old or 20 years old
right,
doesn't change
yeah,
anything.
yeah,
It still happened. That character,
in
it
the
still
world,
happened.
right, yeah, in the world of, especially in Father Callahan, in the world of Salem's Lot, there was like at some point he was 10 years old. You know what I mean? Even though it's not in the
Right.
book Salem's Lot, it makes you think about fate and everything else in the real world when it comes to like moments in your life that have like some grand meaning,
So yeah,
and
exactly. Like,
making the right decision in that moment, and how everything up to that led to this.
so there was
Um,
probably a part in John Cullum's life where like he could have, say, moved to
yeah,
South Carolina or done
yeah,
something else that would have taken him off this path
yeah,
and he
but
wouldn't
he
have been
didn't.
there. But he didn't because was it
Because
because he was written this way, or
right,
was it because in his actual life he chose that, or was it because
yeah.
Ka kind of
And
put
so
the
I'm
notion in
still
his head?
I think this conversation is going to be more carried over into the next section
Yes, it
because
will be. You'll
it
get
deals
more
with.
answers, definitely. I'm not,
Well,
I'm not going to say
I mean specifically section part 2 when we record the next episode, because I have a question about part 2. Like I said, we've already read it, but we're not going to spoil it for part 1 readers,
right.
listeners. But this conversation definitely is going to carry over into part 2. So if you're listening, we're going to carry that there. But is Stephen King Ka? And you can't. I don't think there's a true answer to the question.
Yeah.
But yet, I guess where it deals into this, and we talked about this in the recording that we lost, so I'm going to do my best to reiterate it here. But Roland is a unique situation because not only did Stephen King write Roland's story, but in Roland's story, he goes to Stephen King and hypnotizes him and then tells him his story. Whenever King meets Roland, he doesn't know who he is yet, right?
Right.
Or no, he does,
He
because he
does,
had
but
wrote The Gunslinger,
he had
but he
written
didn't know the
like
rest.
he'd written
Yeah.
the stuff in the magazines, like
Yeah.
the essential
Right.
stories, but he hadn't actually
Huh.
fleshed
So in
out
a way,
like because
Stephen
Eddie hadn't
King.
been written yet, and he meets Eddie.
Well, this
Eddie
is
hadn't
a
even become a character yet. So
right,
like,
right. So, but this think about this philosophically though. All right, so Stephen King spoke Roland into existence, right? So King, whether he's God or Ka or Gan or whatever in this world, he spoke Roland into existence. But that wasn't enough for Roland. Roland became more than just what he was predetermined to be, because Roland, even before Stephen King had written the rest of his story, went to Stephen King, hypnotized him, and told him his story. So in a way, Roland is like the only character that has written his own story. He's become more than what King intended
right.
in doing that.
So here's where I'm going to freak you out a little bit more.
All
So
right.
Stephen King didn't breathe life into Roland.
Mm.
Robert Browning
Oh, that's right.
originally
Yeah.
breathed life into Roland, and who
That's right.
knows
Yeah.
if he got that from somewhere else, because Stephen
Yeah.
King's inspiration for this came from Robert Browning's poem about Roland. So
Yeah.
is that the Roland that existed
Yeah.
and then told Stephen King, or like
I think
you got all this stuff? So like, here's my
okay.
thing. So like, and I do know, obviously more than what you know, but
Yeah.
to me, when you talk about, and they've already kind of hinted at this a good bit when they've talked to King and some of the aspects of what's been happening, that Gan and God are, I don't know if they're exactly one and the same. I think it just kind of depends on from what perspective. Like, I think like to Callahan, there's God, to Roland, there's Gan, and
Oh, yeah, yeah.
like kind of thing, but they're essentially the same great being.
Yeah.
And then you have Ka, which is kind of like a predestination thing. Like you've got, like, not that you don't have free will, but
Mhm.
that things are essentially laid out for things to happen. And you know, there's water if Ka wills it. There's water if
Right.
God wills it. There's that aspect, and Roland, and that is kind of like the will of Gan or God. And essentially, Stephen King is there because the reason they're trying to save him is because if Stephen King dies and gets hit by the van, then he can't rewrite the story
Yeah.
of Roland. He can't finish it because he's already started it, but he can't finish it. And therefore, if he can't finish it, then the Dark Tower crumbles, the universe crumbles, and then they don't have to worry about destroying the beams and bringing the actual tower down, because the death of Stephen King will. And I think essentially what that means is that Stephen King, he is not Gan and he's not God. He's kind of like, I don't know, maybe you think of him like the Catholics would think of the Pope. He's like his representative on earth. Not necessarily like Jesus, not quite that powerful, but like maybe somewhere in between what Jesus and the Pope would be. Like he's like God's
He's a
representative.
he's a prophet
And he's a
of
prophet,
yeah.
and he does
But
what he writes does bring it into existence in a sense, but it's I think it's more of like it exists already, but until it's put onto paper, it's not
well,
come to fruition yet.
let's talk about that more
Right. And
in the
yeah.
next section.
And then,
But
so basically, after this, they go back to Turtleback Lane. They go to where they had met John Collin there. They do all this stuff, and then they go back through a doorway, and then they're reunited
yeah,
with Susanna,
yeah.
Jake, and Oy, and that kind of ends that whole
I
section.
want to string so yeah, I think we covered this part 1, but I want to string two things together that you just talked about, and then
Okay.
we can end the show on this idea. So you mentioned that not only was Roland, I mentioned that Roland was written by Stephen King, but then Roland is the only character that kind of went back to Stephen King and then told him his story. So in a way, Roland got to write his own story. He got to become something bigger than what his creator originally intended. But then you mentioned that Roland, the character, actually came from a poem by a different writer. What'd you say his name was? Mark Brown?
Robert Browning.
Robert Browning. And I've always thought of those two things separately, but I think I can string them. So the idea that there's a whole story and now a whole series written based on a character that is in a poem, I've always thought of that as the like we stand on the shoulders of giants thing, where all art is somehow influenced and based on some other art. And because Roland read, or not Roland, because Stephen King read that and got inspiration from it and then wrote a whole new story from it. It was something bigger than what the original writer of the poem, what Robert Browning, is something bigger than what Robert Browning ever considered. And
Right.
likewise, the story that Roland gave to, and I realize in real life this is all Stephen King, but I think that it kind of the through theme to this whole thing, to this whole Dark Tower series, has been that like we stand on the shoulders of giants, and any art that we create lives on after us and becomes something bigger than us and something greater than us. Something greater and bigger than we intended it to be. And I think that that says something special just about art in general and about writing and telling stories, and all art is also like of this same principle. But also philosophically, I think there's a special message there too, that you can be something greater than you ever thought you could be, or that your circumstances would allow. And
Right.
so I think that that's sort of the ongoing theme of these stories. And I think we can draw that thread through there. So we don't need to read. We're done. We don't need to read
We're
the rest.
done.
We
Yeah.
figured it out. We figured out the Dark
What,
Tower.
one last thing, I really find it funny the way King writes about himself and then
Yeah.
writes about how Roland sees him. Because,
Hmm.
Roland
Hmm.
does not like Stephen King. Like, he does not like
Yeah.
him. And
Yeah.
Stephen King writes the way he writes about himself as a fiction character, because, it's a work of fiction. But in that
Yeah.
book, he talks about how he's a lazy writer, how he's like a hack, how he's like all this. And,
Yeah.
the whole time you're like, that's completely not true. But
Right.
you wonder if that's how he actually sees himself,
Oh yeah.
or
Yeah.
is that a little bit of self,
It's I don't know. I don't know. I
you're
don't know if
right.
Stephen King is self-deprecating in the way that like he's doing it to seem
Or is it like a kind of a wink kind of,
like I don't know if he truly believes those things about himself, or if it's like he's smart enough to know he doesn't want to come off as like super conceited, so he says
right.
those things
So
about
he
himself.
says those things. Yeah.
Right, yeah, I don't know. And it's probably not 100% one or the other.
Right.
He probably is self-conscious and insecure about certain things, but also he knows that he can't like write himself to be super confident either.
Right. All right.
All right, well, let's stop this thing and make sure it saves before we move on to the
Before we
next
move
one.
on to the next section.
I don't want to do this one a third time.
No, definitely not.
But thanks for listening, and stay tuned next week for part 2. And oh man, it's a doozy. It's
It
a
is a
doozy.
doozy.
All right, thanks for listening. Peace.
See ya.